All right, this week with chapter 18, we're going to talk a little bit about this chapter. It is a big chapter. There's a lot going on, so we're going to try to hit this as hard and fast as we can to kind of help you guide your reading this week. First part of the chapter deals with the Protestant and Catholic Reformations. Protestant Reformation is the one where you see Martin Luther and others that we'll talk about a little bit later on to begin to break away from the Catholic Church because of major problems inside the Catholic Church, such as absenteeism, poor education, immorality, problems at the top, problems at the bishop level, problems at the local clergy level. The biggest thing Martin Luther complained about when he began the Protestant Reformation in what is today Germany was the Pope's sale of indulgences. To raise money, the Pope allowed people to purchase indulgences, which technically almost became a get out of sin free card. And Martin Luther, who believed in faith being the only way to get into heaven, was very unhappy about that. It leads to protests, thus the Protestant idea, and eventually a group that will break away from the church. Some of the German princes, the text will point out, will begin to break away with Luther. Some because they were religiously motivated and believed in what Luther was saying. Others saw it as a way to get out from under the taxation and oppressive thumb of the Catholic Church. So what it leads to initially really is the first major breakaway from the Roman Catholic Church since the Orthodox Christians did it. The the text goes on to point out that there are other places where Protestantism began to catch hold, and you'll read about those. Some in England, when Henry VIII will take England out of the Catholic Church in order to gain a divorce. This is the famous Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Henry wants a male child. With the Catholic Church won't grant him a divorce, and so he takes England with Parliament's approval and help out of the Catholic Church and creates the Church of England. John Calvin will be a major Protestant figure in France and a major source of influence later on. So as you read about these things, make sure that you understand that this is a breakaway from the Roman Catholic Church, that the Protestants are unhappy with the state, with the condition of the Catholic Church, and they voice their displeasure and begin to break away. One of the biggest things is that they're successful because of things like the printing press. Martin Luther's 95 Theses would never have been read if you wouldn't have been able to print those, and other people would be able to read them and begin to see the merits of Luther's argument. So the first part of the text really takes you on a religious journey. From there, you talk about, if you look at the map here, you can see the the beginnings of Lutheranism, the beginnings of Protestantism as it begins to spread. But some areas of Europe still remain very Catholic. Spain, France, Italy. Okay, so they still remain very Catholic, and the Catholic Church needed to make some reforms. And the textbook goes on to talk about the Catholic Reformation. Sometimes in old text, it used to be called the Counter Reformation. And you see the church begin to address some of these problems. The Pope Paul III and the Council of Trent later on will address a lot of those problems, make the idea of becoming a priest a little bit more difficult, upping the requirements for education. So and many of the orders that are founded, like the Jesuits, like the Society of Jesus, emphasize education. So there is some things that the church will address, and it's important to understand that in response to what the Protestants were doing, the Catholic Church begins to try to make amends, to reform itself, and try to recruit some of those people back into the church. It doesn't work, but well, some will come back, but not all. The next sort of thing is that you can probably guess this is that with a breakaway part of Christianity in Europe, you're also going to see warfare. So there's warfare in Germany that ends in 1555 with the Peace of Augsburg. There is warfare and violence in France. You can read about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The There is war, and culminates really with the 30 Years' War, which will be dealt with later in the chapter from 1618 to 1648, which is a lot of times considered to be the last of the major religious wars in Europe. So the split between Protestantism and Catholicism these leads to warfare, leads to the split in Christianity, and that's sort of where you begin to kind of pick up. So the the first part of the text deals with this, okay, and the violence. It goes on to talk a little bit about the social order and peasant life, okay, and you can read this stuff for yourself. It's actually pretty simple stuff, and I'm not going to go over it and waste a whole lot of time on it because you can read that. The most important part is probably this: the economic crisis and the popular revolts. You have a major climate change. You have a lot of crop failures, disease, starvation, and that's going to lead to some major crises in Europe. And so you can read about those as you go through the chapter. But I want to get to the two big things. Oh, and by the way, the 30 Years' War, you need to read about that too. But I want to get to the two big things that the chapter talks about, which really is Europe after the 30 Years' War. There are two competing sort of ideas that begin to develop in Europe about government. And what it leads to essentially is two very distinct types of government. The textbook talks about the development of what we call absolute monarchy. Okay, the you see absolute monarchy in various places. All right. Spain, you might consider to be an absolute monarchy, but it is in decline. So, really, the first modern sort of absolute state that we talk about is France. France will become our best example of the absolute monarchy. So there are a couple of things that, as you read about absolutism in France, you need to be aware of. This all begins; it's a process. This doesn't happen overnight. Okay, Louis XIV, our best example of the absolute monarchy, doesn't wake up one day and say, "Ooh, no." Okay, it is a process. It begins really under Henry IV, which you'll read about with the Edict of Nantes, where he grants some religious toleration. Henry IV was very popular, really may have been able to become even more powerful, but he's assassinated in 1610. His son, Louis XIII, will take over. He is not very interested in really being a king. He loves being a king. He loves doing all the kingly things, but he doesn't want to make all the hard decisions. So he actually appoints a prime minister, actually a cardinal inside of the Catholic Church, Cardinal Richelieu, to be his enforcer. And Richelieu is tough, and he builds the strength of the French monarchy. You Then, when you get to start reading about Louis XIV, you'll see that when Louis XIV becomes king, he's very young, and he has a cardinal minister as well. But Mazarin is not as popular. When the 30 Years' War ended, he tries to bully a lot of the French nobility, and it leads to some uprisings. One called the Fronde, for example. Louis remembers this stuff. When he becomes king, he's determined to make sure that he controls everybody. When you get to Louis XIV, he is the best example of the absolute monarchy. He believes in divine right. God gave him the ability to rule. Okay, he is going to rule by himself. He revokes the Edict of Nantes. He carries on warfare by himself. He has power over the taxation system, over how money is spent, over how all of these things in France run through him. He becomes the central figure, and that's why we say it is an absolute monarchy. So Louis XIV is our best example. Okay, and he's able to make war on other people in Europe, especially on the Netherlands, because he controls foreign policy. He creates a standing professional army. And that is one of the most important things. He also leaves France bankrupt practically when he dies. So, as you read about this, make sure that you understand Louis's absolute tendencies and what he does to be absolute. The one of the big things that you talk about, and this doesn't really catch a lot of people's eyes until we start really talking about it, and that's mercantilism. Mercantilism is this economic system that's discussed. One of Louis's ministers, Colbert, is one of the big pioneers and one of the big supporters of mercantilism. Mercantile states want to be self sufficient. They want to get raw materials as cheaply as possible. They want to increase their holdings of gold and silver. They want to be have a favorable balance of trade. They want to be self-sufficient. To do that, they need colonies, and you'll see a big colonial push later on. So make sure that you read about mercantilism. There are others that try to follow Louis's example. You'll read about the Austrians and the development of absolute monarchy in Austria. You'll also read about the later on about Russia and where Russia is going to follow a similar pattern. So these absolute, if you're a king in Europe, everybody wants to be absolute. I would want to be absolute. I would want to make sure that everybody did what I said. And it's great to be an absolute monarch as long as you're the monarch. You get to build palaces like Versailles. You're surrounded by ritual and art and culture. So everything runs through you, remember. So the absolute monarchy is, especially if you're the monarch, the way to go. Now, we're going to stop here and I'm going to make a separate video about this, okay? So as we get into this next phase, you're going to start seeing the counterexample, all right, which is constitutionalism and what develops in England. And I want to take you through that so you can understand the difference between those two. This first part, though, of this chapter about the Protestant Reformation, about the wars of religion, and then later about absolute states is really important because what you're doing is you're setting up a contrast here. All right, so look for this next video about constitutionalism coming up.